All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to week 11. This is Summer of Shipping week 11, which is pretty crazy. We're coming up to the end of the month. We actually only have these Thursday meetings slotted until the end of July. So it'll be interesting to kind of see what happens right around the change of the calendar into August. But we'll talk about that in a moment. So last week we had a guest presentation from Swix. I think that was one of my favorite presentations of the summer so far, and I learned a lot just by him being here, and I hope everybody else did too. We were able to ask him some questions, and so if you haven't seen that yet, it's on YouTube. You can kind of watch a little, just the entire thing, and if you have any questions for Swix, you can just reach out to him on Twitter. That's one of the beautiful things about him just being on Twitter and open to questions and stuff. This week, we're going to talk about unit testing. That was a topic that when I asked people what they were interested in learning about, unit testing was surprisingly, at least for me, the #1 topic. And so I wanted to do a little bit on that and kind of just share how I think about unit testing. And we'll go over some study groups, interview prep, and demo list as usual. Finally do the demos at the very end. So as always, I'm going to keep everybody focused on what our objectives are. These are our objectives. So the first one is get the interview, second one is pass the interview, and third one is improve your job skills. So with getting the interview, that's going to be improving your projects and perhaps improving your public resume. So we've talked a lot about that already. Number two, pass the interview. So we have on Tuesdays at this time, interview prep. And so Pedro and John lead that, and they've done an amazing job. A little update on that in a moment. And then finally, we talk on Thursdays, we talk about things that can potentially help you on the job. So today, that's one of them, is unit testing. So a little announcement, right, is, hey, remember the last Thursday meeting, at least the planned one, is actually on July 30th. So after this, there will only be 2 more that are planned. And after that, we'll probably transition more into just a casual, whoever's available on the Discord, we'll just ping people and just meet up in the Discord. And that's kind of probably how we'll operate. It'll be a little bit less structured, a little bit less formal. We may not record everything, but that's kind of the idea moving forward after July 30th. So moving into August, the school starts back up. People are going to be busier again, and so just make it a little bit more of a casual thing. Community will still be around, but essentially that's kind of what to expect. All right, so study groups. At the same time, we're spinning up study groups, and I'm really excited for this. And so the first one is actually going to be about designing data-intensive applications. This is, I've only read select chapters from the book before, and what I have read, I've absolutely loved from it. It's amazing. And so what we'll try to do is read about 1 chapter or less per week. Justin is going to be our section leader, so he's going to dictate the pace, when we start, how often we meet, how much we're going to read in each meeting, especially as school picks up for a lot of people. In August, September, probably when we're going to be finishing up the book is probably around then. Just understanding how to figure out how much to read. So look to him for that guidance. It starts next week on Wednesday at 5 p.m. So Pacific, so same time as this meeting. Oh, we have a little thing in the chat. Yep, and Justin says looking forward to seeing everybody. So Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, so that's same time as this meeting, just on Wednesday, so in 6 days. If you're interested, check out in the Discord the Data Intensive channel, and we'll have more discussion and stuff over there. For example, how do I get the book? How do I read the first chapter, that kind of stuff. We can help people figure that out in the Discord. So if you want to join us Wednesday next week at same time as this meeting, I will definitely be there, and looking forward to how that will be. And we'll just do the meeting over Discord. So cool. All right, so a little check-in with SOS interview prep. So we had our 4th meetup for that, which is exciting. That's crazy to me. It's already been 4. I feel like we just started this up. But big shout out to Pedro and John for taking the lead on this. People are getting lots of practice, a lot of mock interviews. John presented on binary trees this week. So for those who are unfamiliar with data types or in fact need a refresher, this is an excellent way to do it. I think John did an amazing job. I wasn't there for the entire thing. I had to dip a little bit early today. But what I did see, I was like, oh man, I forgot some things. And even for myself was very, very useful. So I hope to see you there. Again, it's also at 5 p.m. Pacific, but on Tuesdays. So you can kind of see a trend here. We have Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday things going on at the same time every day. All right, demo list. Big shout out again for everybody who demoed. So this is what we had at the beginning of last week. And then after last week, we had a few more. So I'm just going to go back and forth so you can see everybody. So that's Theodora, Samson, Ken, Jason, and Oshin, who all demoed last week. And so Very huge, big shout out to everybody there. It grows. Again, goal is to get, this list to be longer. So we'll need smaller font and more columns. That's the goal. We only have a few weeks left to make that happen. So I want to see people to, just make this list. All right. So let's talk about unit testing. This is a topic that I personally, when I first started, I think I shared a few meetings ago or one of these slides where I pretended to understand unit testing when I first started my first job. And I think, one of my old coworkers and good friends, Adrian's online, and I don't know if I've actually told him the story, but essentially like there was this meeting and we're talking about like how we have to prove coverage and, what we can do to help. And there was a presentation on unit testing and I was like, oh yeah, I totally understand what this is. And I went and I started writing unit tests and I absolutely couldn't do it. And I basically avoided writing unit tests for months on the job. And I pretended I knew it and I was just avoiding it because I was busy or whatever. Anyways, I don't want you to have that same thing. So let's talk about unit testing and let's get rid of some of the kind of the mental models that trip people up a little bit. So why talk about it? Well, one, you were all very curious. It was the highest upvoted topic of the things I proposed. And so I was very surprised to see that. I thought unit testing would be something that would be boring, but a lot of people wanted to know. You'll need it for pretty much your first task, depending on what stage your company is at. If you work at a bigger company, almost like certainly, your code reviewer is going to be like, hey, where are your tests? But it sounds easy, right? You write your code and you write your tests and that's all you do. Yeah. What's so hard about that? But there's actually a lot of unintuitive things that don't come obvious. Like for the first thing is actually, you get into a lot of untestable situations very quickly, very easily without even realizing it until you go to write your test. And so we'll talk about a few of those. And one of the things that you can get around this problem is with the concept called dependency injection. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Then there's these concepts of mock, stubs, spies, fakes. And you live in jargon hell when you start unit testing. It's like, oh, like if you want to test in React, you use Jest, and then you might see all these crazy concepts, or use, like different mocking libraries have, crazy names for all this stuff, and you probably get overwhelmed immediately. Eventually, if you're working on tests, you might be in a situation where you have unmaintainable tests, and then, just throw in matchers in there because that's something that can confuse people for a while. We're actually not going to talk about matchers and argument captors and stuff like that, but that's another slightly more advanced topic that people get tripped up on. So what we are covering, we're going to just do some unit tests 101, some things that are untestable, talk about mocks, not really stubs. I kind of should be updating these slides, but I forgot to. We'll talk about dependency injection. I myself am a disciple of this book called Working Effectively with Unit Tests. It's also known as WeWhat, and we'll refer to that in this presentation. There's a link to this in the slides. I've shared the slides. And if you go to that website, I believe the book is available for a free download. So it's actually available for free. And you can pay anywhere from $0 to $15 or however much you want for the book. But as students, I don't think people would be very upset with you if you just got it for free. You don't have to pirate it. It is the author is a pay what you can kind of approach. So unit test 101, what is a unit test? And so this actually comes from a book called The Art of Unit Testing. I thought this definition was really great. And so why reinvent the wheel? Let's just use theirs. So a unit test is a piece of code, usually a method, that invokes another piece of code and checks the correctness of some assumptions afterward. So the key point is that unit test is code, right? And we'll talk about some other key points actually, but that's one of the key things to think about. This actually is a quote from WeWhat, and in this quote, the WeWhat is quoting somebody else, Josh Graham in particular. And so they're saying a unit test is essentially a tiny universe where the software exists to do one thing and do it well. So the takeaways here, at least a few of takeaways, is one, it's a tiny universe. I'm going to use this theme over and over again. Again, WeWhat does that a lot, and so I love that. We're gonna keep on thinking about that. The test tube, think of the test tube as a tiny little universe for your experiment. It's perfect. I love this emoji. It's perfect for unit tests. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do, is create these little test tubes of code. And then the thing we're trying to get is correctness. So in that little test tube, we want to make sure everything is correct, right? A couple of pieces of wisdom from WeWhat. The first thing that, and this is a little bit more opinionated, and so we'll dive back into this at the end, but your first introduction to a test will be when it fails. So if you imagine you're on the job, and you're an intern, right? And you start up doing whatever, and you accidentally break something as part of your first task. Well, guess what? You are now need to be the maintainer of a failing unit test. And boy, oh boy, if that unit test is hard to maintain and it has a bunch of dependency on other tests, you could be in for a nightmare. So that's one of the things that I'll talk about at the end, but one of the things to think about. And then there's other thing from WeWhat, basically says, there are drastically conflicting opinions on how to effectively test. If there's a universally right way, we haven't found it yet. And so essentially that's to say a lot of the opinions about testing do not just assume that because someone has an opinion, that's the way to go. There are just so many ways to do things that unit testing, it's all about correctness. And so how can you create a small amount of code that tests one thing and does that one thing well, right? That's ultimately what we want to do, but there's many different ways to do that. So keep an open mind when it comes to testing. Alrighty, so let's dive into maybe not really an example, but something that's really easy to test. So sometimes it's obvious how to test something. So for example, if we have this pretty boring and I might add kind of useless function called add, you essentially takes two values and uses the plus operator together. That's great, but it's very easy to see how we could test this. So on our test side, we might do something like this, and we just want to be able to assert that adding one and one together equals 2, right? It's pretty readable, this framework. And so that's essentially how easy it is. So, right, unit testing isn't hard, right? Well, let's talk about a case where it might be a little bit more complicated. Okay, so this is easy. Let's see what happens when we are looking at dependencies. And so for Adrian and I, this might give us some PTSD looking at these names, but essentially there's this thing that says checkout manager, and it's a class. Pretend that we're working on an e-commerce product. And in the constructor of this class, there is something called a payments manager and a shipment manager. And so that Adrian's saying a little terrible. And that's these things are essentially just constructed in the constructor. And pretend, let's say we have a function that says checkout. And so it takes in a cart. It calls the payment manager. Let's pretend payments manager has a charge function. And so you pass in a cart and it charges it. And then afterwards, we go to the shipment manager. We generate the shipment. So now we have shipment that's being created. And then we call ourselves to basically deliver this thing. So that's great. I want to point your attention to these two lines right here, because as you can see, we've constructed these dependencies within the constructor. And so the question now becomes, how do we test our checkout manager without also testing payments manager and shipment manager? That's an open question, right? Like if you go back to this easy example, we just called our code and then we used it, called it, and boom, we're done, right? That's like the thing that we wanted to test was X plus Y. In this case, what is it that we want to test? Is it clear? Like what do we want to do? Maybe we want to test that, we call deliver or something. But in this case, there's a few things that get in the way. There's this payments manager and shipment manager. So how do we test our code without also testing payments manager and shipment manager? So let's take a look at another example where we might have, be a little bit, at wit's end to figure out how to test. So assume that we are building something that has, flight tracking or some sort of software with like airlines and stuff, right? And we're using, pretend this is in JavaScript again, that's using Moment.js. So there's a constructor, we'll ignore that, but essentially there's this function called isArriving on a flight. And so essentially a flight has an arrival time, and if the time that is right now is any time between the arrival time and 15 minutes before, if it's between that time range, then it's arriving. So that's how we define isArriving. But look at this little very, very, very sneaky little thing right there. On this line, we are calling now. And so calling moment, which creates a now time. And if we call isArriving at different times, we're going to get different results. And so the question then becomes, how do we test isArriving? If we're going to get different results at different times when we run the same test, all right, what's going on? So that's oftentimes a very tricky situation. Another case that comes up and it comes up a lot, is random. And so let's pretend we're making a game, and there's a class called enemy, right? And again, we have constructor, and now we have this thing called attack. And so there's this attack that basically specifies a random amount of kind of fuzz factor then it's going to be like, some it just adds a little fuzz to your attack. And then the question you might have again is, okay, well, if I run this method over and over and over again, I'm going to get different results. So how do we test attack? Oh yeah, so I added some emojis. People are like, oh, how do we test this in a deterministic manner? So what is the problem here? So the problem is we're trying to test code that we didn't actually write. And so what that means, like in the first examples with Checkout Manager, we only care about Checkout Manager, but we also were testing Payments Manager and Shipment Manager. With time, we don't really care about, like now. And so what we want to be able to do is test the rest of the code around now. But yet we are also running that now function basically. And then with random, we don't actually want to test the implementation of random. We want to test everything around random. And so how do we make that deterministic? Now there'll probably be quite a few solutions around this very particular problem, but what we're going to talk about is perhaps the main one. So the main solution to a lot of these problems is dependency injection. So instead of relying on code that we can't control, we're actually going to inject dependencies that we can control. And this is a pattern of how we write our code. See a couple of things in the chat. Okay, I'm going to answer the questions at the very end, but yeah. One of the things is before, when we constructed the Checkout Manager, it also created Payment and Shipment Manager in the constructor. But what we'll do now is we'll actually pass in Payments Manager and Shipment Manager as dependencies as part of the construction process. So instead of us creating our dependencies get passed to us. And this seems like such a small change, but this, like when I first realized this made my code testable, it blew my mind, even though it's such a small thing. And the reason for that is if we wanted to test this, instead of passing in real implementations of Payments Manager and Shipment Manager, what we can do is pass in these sneaky little mocks here. And instead of giving the real Payments Manager and Shipment Manager, we can give it these bullshit like classes or these, excuse my language, these mock little objects that we can control. And I think I'm missing some closing parentheses and a semicolon there. So obviously I did not run this code. Okay, so dependency injection. Without dependency injection, this is what the thing looks like. We have a payments manager and a shipment manager such that once this checkout manager is created, those are locked, right? We can't do anything. It's so rigid, like we have to run that code. With dependency injection, like we pass in shipment manager and payment manager, and now these things are free to move, okay? And so we can swap them out for mocks. And so as you can see, these little bald eagles, they represent freedom. And so dependency injection gives us a degree of freedom that we can play around with. And that makes our code testable. Very, very important concept. So let's talk about mocks now. So if you go back here, instead of using the real implementations, we swap them with mocks. And so let's talk about mocks. What are mocks? So mocks allow us to turn code that we can't really control into black boxes. When some function is called, we can return X. And it can also be used to verify that we've called the mock with the right parameters. And let's take a look at something in Mockito, which is Java. I really like Java's approach to, or Mockito's approach to mocking and unit testing. I think it's very clean. Other libraries, for example, the one I use back here, Sinon for JavaScript, is very confusing because they have all these terms. But Mockito is much cleaner in my opinion. Anyways, so this is an example straight, I just pulled from Mockito's website, and here we're actually mocking out a linked list. And so pretend we don't actually care about the implementation of a linked list. We just want to use a mock. We could do something like this. The first line creates the mock, and the second line allows us to control the mock. So that's kind of essentially what's going on. And the way I like to think about this is the mock is essentially a puppet, okay? And then when we call these when statements, we're basically, the puppet's here. And we can now tell the puppet to do whatever the heck we want. And that allows us to control the flow of our code very, very well without knowing anything about the internals. So essentially, Instead of actually using real implementations, we can use little puppets. I personally like the term puppet. Maybe they should have used, maybe we should just rename all mocks as puppets, but whatever. All right, so let's kind of see this play out. So without a mock, essentially what would happen is we have our unit test, we set up our checkout manager, and then when we run our test, our checkout manager calls payment manager, which might call Stripe, and then we're making a call to Stripe just by calling checkout manager. That's kind of annoying. So let's hide that for a second. Now let's look at what happens in the world with a mock and dependency injection. So in this case, we set up our checkout manager and our mock. So we'll do both of those in our test setup. So make sure we pass our mock into our checkout manager, right? Dependency injection. So, and when we run our test, now we call checkout manager calls the mock. Remember, we set up this mock such that it does exactly what we want it to do. And then it just returns the result. We don't call Stripe. We don't do any of these weird things. And it's very straightforward. So that is the benefit of a mock, right? You can control, instead of like running code that you don't want to run, we keep our little test universe small and just run the code in checkout manager. So that's the primary benefit. So mocks and dependency injection. This will get you out of so many untestable situations. I didn't actually go over how you could potentially use dependency injection to get around the problem with random and now. But essentially what you can conceive of is passing a now function into the, into the argument of what we were doing, and swap out the implementation of a now function such that you have full control over it. And you can do the same thing with random. And so instead of relying on the math.random static function, you pass in a function that basically behaves like random, and then you can control that during the time of your test. And that's one way you can get around this problem. There are other ways that people solve this problem, but dependency injection will solve your problem. 90% of the difficulty, maybe not 90%, but a large percent of the difficulty of unit testing is understanding jargon. Actually, I should rephrase it, is understanding jargon and then getting your test runner set up, because that is a huge pain in the ass. If anybody has tried to set up just any kind of unit testing framework, oftentimes it's a lot of work. And so that's 90% of the difficulty is understanding these concepts and then getting your first test to even run. It's just really obnoxious. And the thing I'm very frustrated by is a lot of the distinction between all these things, stubs, spies, fakes, mocks, everything else. Those are all, the distinction is very pedantic and it's just not very useful to kind of nitpick those differences. That's why I'm just using mocks here for everything. And Mockito kind of does the same thing, which is why maybe I am philosophically aligned with Mockito. So let's ignore all that. And now you understand mocks, and so you have the mental model for how to get around these testing problems. Master mocking and dependency injection, and you'll be a unit testing star. So that's essentially my little message there. And one thing I love about the dependency injection is it actually embodies this higher level idea, which comes from computer scientist David Wheeler, I think, who said all problems in computer science can be solved by another level of indirection. And so, you just add another layer to the problem, and that layer allows you to do creative things. And so it may not seem obvious that you need this layer, but sometimes when you are stuck, having the ability to do that with another layer, another level of indirection can solve a lot of your problems. And so a little piece of philosophy right there. And this is kind of, the main takeaway here is, with mocking and dependency injection, you can control your tiny little universe. And that's how you get control again. And then you can make your universe even smaller and smaller by taking this to an extreme. There's some things where some people might, not really want to test some stuff, but, you might be okay with not testing your math.random. You might be okay with not testing your now function. But, taking it to the extreme, you can control everything. So here are a little few extras and opinions I wanted to add. One thing that I oftentimes see a lot of junior people do is they test a lot in one function. They basically are testing very large amounts of code. And maybe, they're asserting 4 or 5 different things. Like I can't give you a great example, but it's like they'll have maybe a render function, and they're testing like, oh, render, this element and this element and this element and this element. So they're testing the render of like 4 or 5 different elements. No, just test one at a time. So don't test too much. Test keep the universes small, right? That's the one thing I want to really drive home is if you keep the testable universe really small, it's going to make your tests a lot easier to write. They're going to be a lot easier to maintain. And so this is hugely important. If I can drill this into your head, or if I can inject this into your head, then I will be very happy. Another thing, and this comes from WeWhat, and this is something of perhaps a more contentious opinion, is avoid shared setup. So when a test breaks, you don't want to worry about the shared dependency with 27 other tests. And so like one of the things that I pulled the second quote from WeWhat. And so essentially what he's saying is advocates of setup argue that you need only pay the understanding cost once. But I contend it's much more likely that you'll pay it once per encounter. So every time you need to go touch a test in that test suite and it has a shared setup, you're going to have to go and understand the setup again. And in my experience, this is very true. Every time there's a shared setup and there's a problem, I have to go and reread like this entangled mess of shared code. And that slows me down so much. And and so my opinion is I very much agree, don't do it. At my first job, we had a bunch of code that really did that. And oh my God, I lost so much time just kind of trying to understand that code. And nobody understood the setup anymore. It was actually multiple classes doing multiple things. And it was crazy. Now, that wasn't necessarily a unit test per se, but the idea still remains. One really nice framework I love for unit test is this concept of given, when, then. And so oftentimes what you might see in some of my test code is I'll have comments that say like, comment given, and then I'll do some setup. And this is where I create all my puppets, aka my mocks. This is where I create the class under test, for example, checkout manager. You set up all your, variables, like, your constants, everything. You put them in the given block. And then there's another little comment that says when. And so it's usually just one line. And I'm doing an action. For example, it's checkout manager dot checkout. And that's just when. So that's the one action I'm performing. So I'm just testing that. And then in the then block, those are where all the assertions happen. So that's essentially the thing that I really, really love. And oftentimes, it doesn't always work like this. Sometimes you need to verify that the mocks were called with certain parameters. That's a very important part of testing. And so what I often write is like given, when, verify, then. And so I'll basically verify that certain things were happening. But anyways, if you just remember given, when, then, you will write pretty clean tests. Everybody who I've seen with comments that say given, when, then, it just shows to me that they know what they're doing. And almost always their unit tests are very, very easy to read. And the final thing is just for the love of it, read WeWhat. It's a relatively short read. It's free. It's the best book on testing that I've found. Not that I've read a bajillion of them, but I've read a couple, or at least read chapters of quite a few. And I very much am a fan. So that's my little spiel on unit testing. And this is the book. Go find this. Go read this. You don't have to read all of it, but definitely be influenced by it. It will improve your unit test. And that's it. Okay. So action items for this week. Remember, what we're trying to do is have a mentality of no 0 days, ship daily, even if it's just a little bit. And take to Twitter, keep yourself accountable. It's okay if you have to take a break or whatever. I've had to take breaks. I've had to take breaks for 2 weeks at a time, and just restart it whenever you're ready. Remember, there's only 2 Thursdays after this one left to demo on the main stage. And so get your teams ready to demo in July. After that, the stage is kind of going away. It'll be a much smaller stage, and it'll be a little bit less, of a big event. So make sure that happens. And as always, try to reach out to a mentor that best aligns with your career goals. So check out the mentor list and just scan for any profiles that you're like, oh man, this person, they have a career that if I were to follow in their footsteps, at least for however many years, I would really be just excited for that. And so make sure to reach out to them. Our mentors have made themselves available, and they want to be able to help you. And so take advantage of that during the summer while you still have it. And I guess we'll move on to demos next. But I remember there were a few questions in the chat, and so I wanted to go take a look at that before we move on. And so first things first, if anybody wants a demo, make a comment in the chat, and we will do that. Anybody who wants to ask any questions about testing or any things that that kind of came up, feel free to ask them now, and we can do that. All right, so got a question for Mads. The first example, or anything actually, how many tests should be written before we can assume the correctness of a method? Oh, right. So in terms of the number of tests, right, that's going to be a judgment call. I personally believe that, this might be like a little bit code cowboy of me, but I personally believe that you want to write tests that have high return on investment. And so you want to check, a few happy cases, you want to check a few corner cases. For example, we might want to add like a negative number. We might want to add like, an undefined, some other corner cases like that, depending on what we're writing. But the big thing that you really want to make sure is, so long as you have your test harness up, if you encounter an issue, you make sure you go add a unit test that replicates that problem. So for example, let's say we had a bug where, for example, we couldn't add the number 0. And so 0 plus 1, let's say, was equal to 0 for some reason. Or 0 plus 1 is equal to undefined for some reason. You want to make sure that you add a test case around that such that people can see it. So that's essentially my kind of answer for that. And I'm actually pretty happy with, again, I'm a little bit code cowboy on unit tests. I'm comfortable with accepting, a diff where not every single corner case is, tested to the max. But yeah, this is kind of my opinion. All right, so next up, we will go to demos. And so if you have a demo that you want to share, drop your name in the chat, and we will turn it to you. And I think we've got one demo today, and so we'll turn it over to Van in a second. Anybody else want to demo? Ping the chat, and we will turn it to you after Van goes. So Van Gogh, that's a artist. Anyways, Van, I will stop sharing, and you have the floor.
Hey. All right, how's my audio coming through?
It's we can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Let's hope that I can share screens. Hello. All right. So I'm basically just doing my build on the wiki page. So I'm gonna hit that. It's changed a little bit, as you can see. But what I got is that I finally fixed dynamic search so that it doesn't search until you hit enter. Or you hit the search button. Either way, it's the same thing. And on top of that, I've kind of added search tags, so we don't actually have anything but media on here because it's like kind of the only thing I found. So I temporarily set it to its own custom searches so that, let's say, we could put into the query media later, but for now it'll just be set to custom searches. So here it'll search Twitter, it'll search the kickoff, it'll search to join us, and hopefully if I just plug in the tags, proper tags, and when we do have those links out, then it'll search to that instead. But that's pretty much it. Don't know if you want to see this this big old mess over here, because I tried removing this, but this didn't work, so I kind of had to fix it somehow else. But yeah, it works, so nobody really cares.
Nice. We've got a question. What's Fuse?
Oh, Fuse. Okay, so I like to call it the godsend, but basically it's a fuzzy search library. What it does is that you can implement it into at least what we did, we put it into Next, but the whole search filters and everything like this. For example, you can even do fuzzy searches, which means that you can spell stuff wrong, and if it's related to whatever you put in, it'll put in. For example, I'm going to spell Twitter wrong on purpose, so TWTTR, and it still shows up. and it goes from left to right what it thinks is the most important. So Twitter, obviously, because it has the most matched cases, and then YouTube because it has a T and a bunch of W's in it. So yeah,
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah,
I,
it's
I can't see the chat.
entirely client side. And so
Yep.
it's a free library. And so if you are trying to implement like you could like most projects are not going to be that big. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Most projects are not even going to be that big. So if you can do client side search, you're going to get extremely great performance. You don't have to implement Algolia for a project that doesn't need it.
Yep. And then you can read more about it on Fuse.js.io. So,
Yeah.
ta-da!
Yeah, great project. And then Samson is asking, how does Next compare to React or Gatsby? There's actually a really great YouTube video that I've been recommending people watch on this, although I think the line is blurring. And so essentially, the person is basically asking, do you need server-side rendering? Do you need, I forget exactly, are you trying to mostly do static pages? Or I forget exactly what the questions were, but essentially it's like a flow chart. And ultimately at the end of the flow chart, the terminal nodes are Create React App, Gatsby, and Next.js. So those are the big three, although it's kind of funny. They're all like Gatsby and Next.js seem to be encroaching on each other in terms of who's doing what. It's like I can no longer tell, like Gatsby is like, oh, we're the static side guys, and then Next.js is like, oh, actually we do that too, and so yeah, it's kind of confusing. Awesome. So hey, Van, let's give you a round of applause. I think everyone's on mute, so again, as always, it's going to be me clapping. But if anybody else wants to do a demo, let's do that. All right, Nico demo. So let's get Nico up and running.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Right, so you kind of scared me into shape because we've only got a couple more opportunities to demo, so I'll just go ahead and get this out there because we haven't demoed it all yet. So kind of bad about that, but
all good.
So basically our app is a React client, Scala backend, Postgres database. It's all Dockerized. Here is our app. Stylistically and visually, not all that much just yet, but we've got all the pipeline, all the pipeline connected together. So on this page you land, you see all of our groups. The idea of our app is to have groups of content, and you navigate into a group, see all of the content associated with that group, and then navigate to the contents page. And here's where we're going to have a bunch of images showed up associated with that content.
Yeah.
So like I was saying, the client is all written in React. Our backend server is written in Scala using the Play framework. Our database is Postgres, and everything is running in Docker, which I think is pretty cool. We've got a container for each one of those things running. The front end will recompile if you change anything. Backend will also recompile if you change anything, so it makes development a breeze.
That's super cool.
We've got our API thus far is pretty much just get those groups, post a group, delete a group, add content to a group, because our content can belong to multiple groups. It's a group can have several pieces of content, and a content can belong to several groups. So we also have get an individual content and post an individual content, and then use these endpoints to add those contents to a group. And to assist in development, we're using Postman to, so you can work separately either on the client or on the front end. So Postman is a tool that we use to kind of easily interact with our backend without actually having to have any features built out in the front end. So one of those might be like get all of our content groups. It sends a request to this address. We get all our groups back. This is one of those endpoints that the client is already using. Some of our endpoints behave a little bit differently. Like say this endpoint gets a whole bunch of groups, but if we get an individual group, we might get some bonus information like the contents that that group is associated with. So we can kind of make some of our endpoints a little bit leaner and maybe make scaling a bit easier. And so we use Postman for that. I already showed the UI. We've got our React router showing different views depending on what's in the URL. and using URL parameters to load different models from the backend. And if another interesting thing we got going on is that we're actually using Mirage to mock our API. So this front end right now is actually working off of fake generated data, because as is common with a lot of projects, sometimes your UI will kind of get ahead of the progress of your backend.
Yep.
So if you have something like a mock API server, the client developers can get to work on fake data faster than the backend developers can push out a finished API. So all of this data is actually kind of randomly generated every time the app is reloaded. And that's kind of a neat tool to allow UI developers to get to work faster than backend developers can push out work. Another neat tool we're using for kind of DevOps is Liquibase. We have some files. What's this thing? We can run some commands when you clone this repository into your machine. One is for setting up the schema of the database that the backend is going to use, and another command is for seeding the database. And the way that we seed our database is with just CSV files that contain all the data that the command will insert into the database, so that you can quickly set up your client, set up your backend, set up your database, and have it immediately populated with data so that you can hit the ground running and immediately start using all the features that you've developed thus far. I find that that kind of tool is really useful for getting people up to speed, because they don't have to, hit like a series of endpoints to get their database in a state where you can have all these features working. You just clone your repository, run 2 commands, one to set up the schema, one to seed the database, and now you have a fully functioning app with relevant data.
Whoa.
What was the other thing I was going to show? So yeah, like I said, Mirage is running in the front end right now, which is that tool to get the client, unblocked from the back end. I'm going to turn that off so I can actually show what is in the database from the seeding. I'll do that by commenting out that little piece of code right there. And now you may not have seen it happen, but the data actually changed.
And this is now coming from the actual database.
Yeah, so if this is uncommented when React, I suppose, compiles, and this index.js file is loaded into the browser, make server is a call to the Mirage library to make the server. I can also show off our Mirage file that kind of shows how we're faking the API. So make server, let server is new server. Here are the models. These kind of mirror the schema, the tables that are in the database. And I create some factories here that are for kind of generating these fake models. And I can, seeds is, I believe, is always called automatically. And here I'm creating a fake user. I'm creating 5 other kind of fake users. I don't know what that is. 5 posts, 5 groups, and in this for each function here, I'm creating 10 pieces of content for each group. So if I come into here, you'll see 10 pieces of randomly generated content. If I select one of those, what I'm hitting are the fake routes. One is for getting 2 of them is for users in different ways. One is for auth. This is for getting all of our content groups. And so this is the stuff that unblocks the UI, because this stuff is available much faster than, this is going to be available a lot quicker than it would take to develop a functioning Scala backend. So this is how that's done with Mirage.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's super cool. And I want to comment on Mirage, and actually, if you can go back to your OneNote, I think there was one more thing I wanted to point out. But essentially, being able, Postman and Mirage, I think, are like they're used by both like the front end and the back end teams. But like getting Mirage set up for the front end team to unblock them, that is like such a smart thing to do. And it's one of those things that if you guys start using this on your own projects when you cross collaborate, then you're going to really see a improvement and just like, feeling that sense of forward progress. And I think I just found about Mirage just literally like last week, Nico, and I was like, oh man, this is, I remember there was like, if I could run like, mini integration tests on the front end back at my, first job, that would have, that would have saved me so much headache to be able to do that. And using a tool like Mirage could have been the way we could have done that. And so just like, stuff like that, that's such a useful tool. And then Postman, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Postman already, but it's like, these two tools will really like, speed you guys up. And it's actually really cool. This entire project, I think, is just dripping with a lot of best practices. And so like, if you guys, I feel like I should get Nico to do maybe like a quick little a roundup of all the tech that they use and potentially why he thinks it's advantageous to use this stuff. But all of this stuff, if you guys kind of learn some of these tools, they're going to be very useful to have in your toolbox. And yeah, the Scala play framework, I haven't used personally. Adrian, I don't know if he's still on the call, but he raves about Scala, Akka, the play framework, all that stuff. And so it's really awesome to see. So thank you for sharing all that. And I kind of like, hijacked the presentation. So if you want to finish off, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Nico.
No, thank you for those comments. That's one of the things that I'm kind of proud about, because visually, this app isn't really that much to look at. But if you look at all the technology that we have coming together to make this work, it's I'm pretty proud of it, because these are all tools that I've encountered throughout my career that I have appreciated how they make our jobs easier. So having them all in this app, I think, is a pretty cool accomplishment.
Absolutely. No, I see you.
And,
I see you.
Yeah, I think the last thing I was going to show off was, so I showed off this Mirage file where you're creating that fake API and these fake models. And if I comment out that line that actually does that, now the client is going to be reaching out to the back end. Unless something just happened. I think something just happened. Always during the demos.
Always, yeah, exactly. And you try it like the moment before it works, and then you open up a new terminal thing, and then like some environment variables slip away or something, and then it all goes to shit.
Yeah. Okay, I think I know what might be happening. That's not a valid ID from the backend, because in Mirage, the IDs that we're using are just integers, but the real backend, the real database, is using universally unique IDs. Mm-hmm. So that might have caused some kind of problem. But that's going to build up again, and I was just going to show that real data from the database is going to be showing up in the client, which is what it would look like in production, actually deployed. We'd be seeing data from our database, like our actual data. How we're grouping it is we've got a language group, a framework group, and we've got like Scala, React, Play, and JavaScript.
Nice. And Nico, what Postgres tool were you just using?
This is Table Plus. It is free to use. The only annoying thing is it'll bother you every time you try to open more than 2 tabs.
Okay.
So I just live with that.
All right. Yeah, I think I got really used to SQL Pro for MySQL, but now I'm looking for one for Postgres, and I haven't found one. So that is good to know. Table Plus, you said?
Table Plus. Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to check that out. It looks good. I like the way it looks. Sweet. All right. Well, thank you very much, Nico. I know like this is still spinning up, and so maybe we can give it another thing, but we'll give it a few more seconds. If not, we'll take your word for it that it was working before the demo. These things happen, and so we will. I trust you that it was working right before we hopped on. But let's give Nico a big round of applause. Oh, there it is. See, it is. It's working. There we go. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. It came in clutch.
Yeah, right there. And we will now move it to. Yeah, exactly. That was perfect timing. We'll now move to anybody else who wants to demo. If not, then we will just kind of wrap things up. Today, I don't really have a breakout session planned, but I just figured we could kind of hang out in the Discord. So Anybody? Samson has a demo. So I'm just going to ask for any other demos. Any other demos after Samson goes later today? Well, let's Samson, why don't you just take it over, and if anybody else wants a demo after you, we will let that happen. But for now, Samson, it's time for you.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, this is funny. There's actually another project that is not using the Swix stack, not quite, but here, let me share. Okay, so mine is definitely more. So this is actually for the startup that I'm working for as a designer and front-end developer. So as like Nico's is like a lot of really impressive backend stuff. And mine is kind of a lot more like the UI focus, like UX design kind of thing. And I've just started building the actual code for the front end. So yeah, so the company, it's a tutoring, they're building a tutoring platform. And they launched their MVP and they got like they said like a couple like thousands of dollars in revenue or something. So they definitely had a proven MVP. And they're building a V2, and they took me on to help them do the front end and design work. And I guess a few like kind of tools that I want to share that I found. So I went into this. They hired me because they had seen like a blog post I had written about like making landing pages for the client research. And it was like talking a bit about like design thinking, like client research and stuff. So they took me on for that. But the thing is, I had gotten my start by like reading a lot about like designing UIs, but I haven't done it for a while. And this is like a huge platform. So I was a little intimidated at first. Like Phil knows this. I like reach out to him. I was like, what do I do? Like, who can I contact? And I talked to Pedro actually, who runs the interviews as well. And he gave me lots of good resources. But for UI design, one tool that I ended up coming to was user flowcharts. So yeah, so it's this big chart like this that graphs everything. It's a little hard to see here, but I think I just like downloaded one. So yeah, so this is for one of them, right? So it's, you start, you're a tutor, are you signed up? If you are, then log in. If not, you go through this process, get to the dashboard. These are all the things that you might want to do. And then, the processes, you go through them. And for something of like this intricacy, I guess, with like so many different like things that people could be doing when they log in, this is kind of necessary even just for me to think through. But it was also really useful for working with a bigger team and working with a client, because I sent this in and then like immediately, the people would look at it and be like, oh, like this isn't exactly the behavior we want, right? And I didn't have to go into mockups. I didn't like, or like, code down the line, right? It was just, this flowchart's very easy to just drag things back around to where they should be. And that just gets everyone on the same page a lot earlier. And then on the same point, I made, it's actually kind of cool. I have 3 versions of the mockup of the client dashboard. So this is the first one I made. It's like fairly straightforward, right? So like notifications, calendar, and then like subscriptions to tutors, and then book new section. So it's like this like made sense in my mind, right? It was like, okay, like these are the functionality and this is how I'm gonna block it out. But as they go through revision, so this is the second revision here, you can see this has already gotten a little more complicated. So it's your tutors, and then the sessions are like part of the tutor panel. And then like calendar has moved down here, and a new like your student section. These are all just like specific. So like the rest of the team came to me and like the business side of it as well, and be like, we want people to see these things first. And those weren't things that I had like initially thought of, right? Just like thinking about like for me, it's like, okay, these are the blocks of functionality. But then as it goes, the UI does get like, so now you see like the notifications are split up, and book a new tutor is here under like your tutors. And there's just like lots of like little business details that you like work out when you're going back and forth. And yeah, so it's just like really cool working like with a team on a design, I guess, is like one thing I wanted to say, because I hadn't done that before. And then the actual code part was is like this is the thing I've built now. So I spent like all of today just like building this like nav bar, and I'm kind of proud of it because so I was like really dissatisfied with it while I was building it. I was like, I can't get this to look right. But then I came back a bit later and it's like, wait, this looks like Material UI or something, right? This looks like it came out of like a UI library. And even more so when you go to mobile, like I'm kind of proud that I like made it like do this. But this is all just like Tailwind CSS, if any have used, and it actually also uses Next. So I'm just getting into that, which is why I asked. I'm just trying to like get a sense of it. And with Tailwind, it's actually really interesting. So you, instead of like writing out properties, there's class names, right? They're utility classes. So for these items here, like this isn't like normally you'd have a library to style all this, but I just had a ton of a ton of classes, and I just stored it in like a variable here, and then yeah, I just passed it in like that. But yeah, so this is just like I wrote a blog post about how like CSS frameworks was like the death of like handwritten CSS that I like known for so many years. But now I'm full like team Tailwind UI CSS frameworks, like just no more CSS. We're done with CSS. We're just gonna build things and use these libraries. So yeah, so I guess this project so far has been very more like on the UI front end side. And again, like very early stage, but yeah, there's a lot of, I feel like with UI tools, like it's not like everyone building an app has to work with UI, right? But unlike with like coding, you know, you have like, okay, like build a to-do app in 10 minutes, right? And you kind of get the basics of like how a like React works or something. With design, there's not really like design a like good principled interface in 10 minutes, right? Like these resources aren't as common. So I feel like I guess my push here is like it only took me like for me I guess I was like I knew these resources were out there because I read them like a good amount of time ago, but it helped me a lot just like have these ideas in mind and know that the tools that I had to like think about these things. So I guess I would encourage like any of you if you when you're working on UIs to go and like read some like articles on UI design or something, like make some flowcharts and see if you can like yeah like try like putting some effort into that and see like what rewards you might get. Yeah, so that's kind of that's my demo and little thing here.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's super cool. I had not seen what was the tool that you used to generate the flow chart again? What was that called, Samson?
Oh yeah, so it's called Flow Map, and it's kind of so their free plan. They have a whole suite of like UX design stuff, so like personas and like customer journeys and everything. Their free plan actually only allows one here. Let me send this. They actually only allow one flowchart in your per account. So I just have like multiple flowcharts just kind of floating around in one big doc, and it gets a little laggy. But I'm sure there's like alternatives out there as well. It's just kind of like quick for me to use.
Gotcha. I'm I'm just commenting in the Discord with the link to that, and I'll probably have a few more. I think we talked about quite a few resources and demos, which are actually really cool. So I'll probably share those right after this presentation for these things. But thank you for demoing that. That was super cool. Let's give him a round of applause for, I guess, I feel like Samson is up here every week demoing something completely unrelated to the last week.
I gotta keep up my reputation. Yeah, I gotta stay up there. I gotta tie for first on the like.
Yeah, Theodora, I think has got you beat right now, but
yeah.
Alrighty. Let's see if there's anybody else want to do a demo. Alrighty. I guess with that, we are going to just turn off the recording. So I'm going to stop that.